The guard grabbed her wrist before she had taken 3 steps through the palace gate. Grace Holloway felt her heart slam against her ribs, but she kept her head down and her voice steady. The veil across her face moved softly with her breath. One wrong word here, one moment of panic, and everything she had planned for 2 years would be finished before it began. Papers, the guard said. His hand was rough, and his eyes were bored, which was good. Bored men did not look closely. She handed him the folded letter with fingers that did not shake, though they wanted to. The letter said her name was Grace Miller, a widow from the northern villages, hired to work in the laundry of the Crescent Palace. The letter was a lie. Every word of it was a lie except her first name, and she had paid a forger nearly everything she owned to make that lie look true. The guard read it slowly, his lips moving. Behind him, the palace rose into the gray morning sky, tower after tower of pale stone, banners moving in the cold wind. Somewhere inside those walls lived the Alpha King, the most powerful man in the United Pax, the man whose court had once declared her entire family traitors. If anyone in that palace learned that a daughter of the Holloway line of the Ashmore pack was standing at their gate, she would not see another sunrise as a free woman. "Why the veil?" the guard asked, looking up at last. Grace had practiced this answer 100 times in the dark, whispering it to herself, until it sounded natural. "A fire, sir. When I was young, my face is not something people wish to see while they eat their breakfast." It was the truth wrapped inside the lie, and truth always sounded better. The guard's expression flickered with something between pity and discomfort, and he waved her through. Just like that. 2 years of planning, and the gate opened because a tired man did not want to think about burned skin before his shift ended. She walked into the outer courtyard and did not let herself look back. The scars were real. They ran along the left side of her jaw and down her neck, a map of the worst night of her life, the night the Ashmore pack burned. She had been 16. She remembered smoke and shouting, and her father's voice telling her to run, and then heat, terrible heat, and hands pulling her out of a collapsing doorway. She remembered waking in a stranger's cart 3 days later with her whole world gone. Her father, branded a traitor to the crown. Her home, ash. Her name, a curse. 6 years had passed. She was 22 now, and she had learned to survive the way water learns to move around stone, quietly, patiently, taking whatever shape the world demanded. She had worked in inns and farms and washing houses across 3 territories, always moving, always veiled, always careful, and she had saved every coin she could, because coins bought passage across the southern border, and across the border, no one had ever heard the name Holloway. She needed 1 more year of wages, 1 year of work in the best-paying household in the kingdom, which happened to be the household of the very king whose court had destroyed her family. It was madness, and she knew it. It was also the fastest road out. Wolves did not look for rabbits inside their own den. The head of the laundry was a wide, iron-haired woman named Mrs. Pratt, who looked at Grace's veil, sniffed once, and said, "Can you work?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then I don't care what your face looks like." The last girl left because the lie cracked her hands. If your hands crack, you wrap them and keep working. Wages on the last day of each month. Steal anything, and you'll wish you hadn't. Understood? "Yes, ma'am." "Good. You start now." And so Grace Holloway, daughter of a ruined pack, began her first day of work in the palace of her enemy, elbow deep in hot water and soap, her scarred face hidden behind cloth, her real name buried so deep inside her that some mornings even she had trouble finding it. The work was brutal and endless, and she was grateful for that. Tired hands did not tremble, a tired mind did not wander into memory. She washed linens until her shoulders ached, hauled water until her arms burned, and hung sheets in the drying yard, while the wind tried to tear them from the lines. The other laundry girls were curious about her at first, whispering about the veiled woman. But curiosity in a working house has a short life. Within a week, she was simply Grace, the quiet one, the one who never came to the evening fires, the one who took the worst jobs without complaint. Only one girl kept trying. Her name was Molly, a small, round-faced kitchen maid, with flour permanently dusted in her brown hair, and a smile that refused to take no for an answer. Molly brought her warm bread when the cooks were not looking. Molly talked enough for both of them, filling Grace's silence with palace gossip, and Grace learned quickly that gossip was worth more than gold to a woman in hiding, because gossip told her where the danger was. "The king inspected the east kitchens yesterday. Molly said one evening, sitting on an overturned basket while Grace folded sheets. Walked through like a storm cloud. Never smiles, that one. They say his wolf went silent years ago. Can you imagine? An alpha king whose wolf doesn't speak. Grace kept folding. Why would it go silent? Heartbreak, they say. His fiancée sold his battle plans to the rogue packs 5 years back. Nearly cost him the war. Nearly cost him his life. He caught her himself. Molly lowered her voice with delicious drama. Since then, the council brings him ladies from every noble pack, and he sends every single one home. Says he'll rule alone. Says he'll never take a queen. Cold as winter stone, our king. Good, Grace thought. Let him be cold. Let him be a storm cloud walking distant hallways. A cold king who trusted no one and looked at no one was a king who would never notice a veiled laundry girl. Have you ever seen him? Molly asked. Up close? No, and I hope I never do. Molly laughed like this was a joke. It was not a joke. There was one thing about herself that Grace had never fully understood. One danger she could not wash away or hide behind cloth. Her scent. Every wolf carried a scent, faint to most, but she had been told all her life that hers was strange, stronger than it should be. Rain and jasmine and something underneath that people could never name. Her mother used to say it was a gift. Her father used to look worried when he said it was noticeable. In a palace full of sharp alpha senses, noticeable could mean dead. So every morning, before the sun rose, Grace mixed a bitter paste of masking herbs, bought in careful small amounts from 3 different market stalls, so no one seller would remember her, and she rubbed it into her skin, until her own nose could find nothing but the dull, flat smell of nothing at all. The herbs stung. They cost a painful piece of her wages. She never skipped a day. Weeks passed. Autumn deepened into the first bite of winter. Grace learned the rhythms of the palace, which corridors the guards patrolled, which doors were watched, which servants asked questions, and which kept their eyes on their own work. She learned that the king's private wing was in the north tower, and that servants from the outer yards were never sent there, and she was glad of it. She built her small, invisible life the way a bird builds a nest, one careful piece at a time. Coin by coin, the leather pouch under the loose floorboard beneath her cot grew heavier. She allowed herself, some nights, to imagine the border, a little town in the south where nobody knew the old wars, a room of her own. Maybe, someday, a small shop, needles and thread and quiet. A life where she could take off the veil in the sunlight and let people think her scars were just scars, an accident, a sad story, and not the signature of a crime written on her skin. She was hanging sheets in the drying yard on a cold, bright afternoon when the bells rang from the north tower, 3 long notes, the signal that the king was moving through the grounds. The rule was simple. Servants stopped, stepped aside, and lowered their eyes. Grace stepped back against the wall of white sheets and lowered her head, hands folded, one more gray figure among the laundry lines. She heard the party before she saw it, boots on stone, the low voices of advisors, the ring of a guard's armor. They were crossing the far side of the yard. They would pass in half a minute and be gone. Then the wind changed. It swung around from the north, sudden and sharp, lifting the sheets like white wings, and it rushed straight across her, tugging at her veil, sweeping over her skin, and carrying everything it touched directly toward the crossing party, toward the tall figure at its center. And that figure stopped. Grace did not look up. She did not dare. But she felt it, the way you feel thunder in your chest before you hear it. The entire yard seemed to hold its breath. The voices of the advisors stumbled into silence. Somewhere near the center of that silence, a man had gone completely, unnaturally still. She had put on the herbs that morning. She had, every inch of skin, the same as always. But the wash water had been hotter than usual today, and the steam had run down her neck for hours, and there was a terrible thin thread of fear unwinding inside her, whispering that hot water melts many things, and maybe, it had melted just enough. "Your Majesty?" someone said carefully. Grace stared at the ground. Her heart was hammering so loudly she was sure the whole yard could hear it. "Move on," she prayed. "Please, it is nothing. It is laundry and soap and winter wind. Move on." For 5 endless seconds, nothing happened. Then the boots started again, slower now, and the party moved off toward the north tower, and the yard exhaled, and the other girls went back to their baskets, whispering about how strange, did you see him stop? Grace made herself finish hanging the last sheet. Her hands were steady. Her hands were always steady. It was the only trick she truly owned. But that night, alone on her cot in the servants' hall, she doubled the herbs, and she lay awake in the dark for a long, long time, listening to the wind move around the towers of the palace, telling herself that a king who trusted no one and wanted no one had not just stopped dead in a laundry yard because of her. Telling herself, and not quite believing it. Ethan Cole had not slept in 3 nights, and it was because of a smell. He stood at the window of his study in the North Tower, watching the winter dawn crawl over the palace walls, and he felt like a man who had been struck by lightning and was still waiting for his body to understand it. 3 days ago he had been crossing the drying yard, half listening to his treasurer complain about grain taxes, thinking about nothing except how much he disliked meetings, when the wind had turned and the world had ended. Rain, jasmine, and underneath it, something he had no word for, something that reached past his skin and his ribs and closed around a part of him that had been dead for 5 years. His wolf had woken up, not stirred, not shifted in its long sleep. Woken, fully and violently, surging up inside him with a single word that rang through his entire body like a struck bell. Mate. He had stopped walking. He knew he had stopped, because 11 people had stopped with him and stared, and he was the Alpha King, and the Alpha King did not freeze in laundry yards like a boy. He had forced himself onward, said something meaningless to the treasurer, finished the day's duties with a face carved from stone, and then he had come to this study and torn through his own certainty like a man tearing through a locked room. Because it was impossible. Ethan Cole did not believe in fated mates. Or rather, he had stopped believing, the way a man stops believing in warm harbors after the sea has drowned everyone he loves. 5 years ago his wolf had chosen, or he had thought it had, and her name was Helen Marsh, and she had smiled at him across 100 candlelit dinners while she sold his battle plans to the rogue packs piece by piece. 200 of his soldiers had died in an ambush built from her letters. When he finally uncovered it, when he stood in front of her and asked her why, she had shrugged, actually shrugged. Power, she said, as if it were obvious. You were simply the road to it. Something in him had closed that day like a great iron door, and his wolf had gone behind that door, silent, and the silence had lasted 5 years. The healers whispered about it. The council despaired over it. A king with a silent wolf, they said, was a kingdom with a silent heart. They paraded daughters of every noble house through his halls, beautiful, accomplished, ambitious women, and he felt nothing, and he sent them all home. And honestly, he preferred it that way. Feeling nothing was safe. Feeling nothing was armor. And now this. 3 seconds of wind in a laundry yard, and the armor was gone as if it had never existed. His wolf would not be quiet. It paced inside him day and night, restless, hungry, pulling toward the south wing of the palace like a compass needle. Find her, it said, in a voice rusty from 5 years of silence. Find her, find her. There is nothing to find, Ethan said out loud, to his empty study, like a madman. It was laundry soap. It was not laundry soap. He had gone back to the yard that same evening, alone, telling his guards he wished to walk. He had stood among the empty washing lines in the dark like a thief, breathing, searching, nothing. Only lie and wet stone and cold. Whatever it was, whoever it was, the scent had vanished so completely that a colder part of his mind, the king part, the part that had survived treason, whispered a different explanation. Scents that vanish are scents that are hidden, and people who hide things in a king's palace are rarely innocent. That thought should have made it easier. It made it worse, because his wolf did not care about innocence or guilt. His wolf had waited 5 years in the dark and would not go back. On the 4th day, he summoned Daniel Hart. Daniel was captain of the palace guard, a broad, calm man with sand-colored hair and the rare gift of hearing extraordinary orders without letting his face comment on them. He had fought beside Ethan in the Rogue Wars, had carried him off a battlefield once, and was perhaps the only person alive that Ethan trusted completely. I need a list, Ethan said, of every person who has joined the palace staff in the last 6 months. Every servant, groom, cook, gardener, everyone. Daniel's face did its admirable trick of not commenting. May I ask what we are looking for, Your Majesty? Ethan looked out the window. How exactly did a king say it? I smelled someone in the laundry yard, and my dead wolf came back to life, and now I cannot sleep. He settled on a security concern. Of what nature? Someone in this palace is masking their scent, deliberately and skillfully. I want to know who. Now Daniel's face did comment, just slightly, one eyebrow lifting. Scent masking was not a servant's trick. The herbs were costly, the practice was rare, and in living memory it had been used almost exclusively by two kinds of people: spies and fugitives. Quietly, Ethan added. No searches, no interrogations. I do not want the palace knowing the king is hunting inside his own walls. The list arrived the next evening. 41 names. Ethan read it 3 times, and one entry snagged him like a thorn each time. Grace Miller. Laundry. Hired in autumn. A widow from the north. Wears a veil at all times due to old burn scars. A veil. In a palace, where every face was known, one face was hidden. It proved nothing. Burned skin was burned skin, and a woman had every right to cover her scars. But his wolf pressed against the inside of his chest when his eyes crossed that line on the page, and Ethan had learned in war to notice which way his instincts leaned, even when he did not trust them. He devised the inspection to look like nothing. Winter staffing review, the stewards called it. Every servant in the palace would pass through the great hall over 2 days to be counted, confirmed, and dismissed back to work, a routine of paper and boredom. Ethan attended it in person, which was unusual, but kings had whims, and a king with no queen and a silent wolf was allowed his eccentricities. He stood on the dais for hours, while the river of his household flowed past. Cooks, grooms, maids, footmen. He breathed them all. Sweat, onions, horse, smoke, wool, 100 ordinary human smells, and none of them were rain, and none of them were jasmine, and his wolf grew more frantic with every hour, pacing, pulling. She came through late on the 2nd day, in a group of laundry women, walking neither first nor last. Gray dress, gray veil, head bowed exactly as deep as respect required, and not a hair deeper. Hands folded, steps measured. She gave her false name to the steward in a low, even voice, answered the 3 standard questions with 3 quiet answers, and moved on, and she smelled of nothing. Not of soap, not of skin, not of woman, nothing. A hole in the air where a person should be. And Ethan, who had interrogated spies and broken conspiracies, and read the small tells of lying men for a decade, noticed one more thing, the thing that would keep him awake yet another night. Every other servant who crossed that hall, all 40 of the new ones and hundreds of the old, had done the same very human thing. They had glanced at him. One flick of the eyes toward the king. Curiosity, or fear, or awe. One glance, every single one. She never looked at him at all. Not once. Her discipline was perfect. And perfect, Ethan Cole had learned 5 years ago, at terrible cost, was the most suspicious thing in the world. When the hall was empty, Daniel came to stand beside the dais. Anything, Your Majesty? The veiled one, Ethan said quietly. Grace Miller. The burned widow. Her papers are in order. Mrs. Pratt speaks well of her. Hard worker, keeps to herself, no visitors, no letters. No letters, Ethan repeated. No visitors. No face, no scent. He looked down the long empty hall at the door she had gone through. His wolf was silent now, but it was a different silence than before. Not the silence of death, but the silence of a hunter that has finally seen movement in the grass. Tell me, Daniel, what kind of widow washes a king's sheets while erasing herself from the world so carefully that even the world's memory of her would slide off like water? A frightened one, Daniel said, or a dangerous one. Yes, said the king, and I intend to find out which. He turned from the dais, and for the first time in 5 years, there was something in his chest besides winter, something reckless, and alive, and utterly against his will, and it frightened him more than any assassin ever had. Because if the veiled woman was the scent, and the scent was his mate, then his mate was hiding from him inside his own house. And Ethan Cole had spent 5 years learning exactly what people were hiding when they hid from him. The summons came for Grace on a Tuesday, and it nearly stopped her heart. Mrs. Pratt delivered it with a face like curdled milk. You've been reassigned. King's orders, or near enough. his household steward wants extra hands in the north wing. Linens, fires, cleaning. You start tomorrow. Grace's fingers went cold around the wet sheet she was wringing. The north wing. The king's wing. That's what I said. Don't look so honored, girl. It's the same work with fancier walls. Mrs. Pratt sniffed. Well, why they asked for you by name, I'm sure I don't know. By name. The two words followed Grace around for the rest of the day like a shadow with teeth. There were 30 women in the laundry, 20 of them senior to her, and the king's steward had asked for the veiled widow by name. She told herself there were innocent reasons. She was known to work hard and talk little, and great houses prized silence in their private wings. She told herself this while her hands folded linen with perfect steadiness, and underneath the steadiness, her mind was running through the dark like a hunted thing. Run tonight, said one voice inside her. Take the pouch from under the floorboard, go over the wall, be 20 miles south by morning. And be what? Said the other voice, the colder and wiser one. A veiled woman, fleeing the palace the very night after she was reassigned. If they suspect you, running confirms it, and they will have riders on every south road by noon. If they do not suspect you, running creates the suspicion that catches you. Rabbits that bolt are the rabbits the hawk sees. So she did not run. She doubled her herbs again, until her skin stung and her coin pouch grew lighter, and the next morning, she walked into the North Tower, with her eyes down and her heart armored, and she began the most dangerous work of her life, keeping house for the man whose court had destroyed her family. The north wing was quiet in a way the rest of the palace was not. Thick carpets swallowed footsteps. Tall windows let in pale winter light. There were fewer servants, and they moved like careful ghosts. Grace was given fires to lay, linens to change, shelves to dust, and one instruction repeated by the steward 3 separate times. When His Majesty is present, you do not speak unless spoken to, you do not linger, and you do not look at him. The last part, at least, she had no intention of disobeying. She saw him on the second day. She was kneeling at the hearth in the long gallery, building the evening fire, when she heard the door and the boots, and every hair on her arms rose before her mind even caught up. She kept her eyes on the kindling. He crossed the gallery slowly, too slowly. A man walking to somewhere walks with purpose. This man was walking the way a wolf circles. The boots stopped 3 yards away. You're the new girl, said the king of the United Pax, from the laundry. His voice was low and even, the voice of a man who never needed to raise it. Grace rose, bowed her head, and fixed her gaze on the floor stones. Yes, Your Majesty. Grace Miller. Yes, Your Majesty. Silence. The fire took, small flames crawling up the kindling, and still he stood there, and she could feel his attention on her like heat on the wrong side of glass. Then he said, in the same even voice, the burns. How did you come by them? Careful, whispered everything inside her. Careful, careful. The truth about the fire lived far too close to the truth about her name. A house fire, Your Majesty. When I was young. In the north. The north is a large place. A small village, Your Majesty. Not one a king would know. Try me. I know a great many small places. There it was, the first hook, dropped so lightly it might have been courtesy. Grace let one beat of silence pass, exactly the length of a shy servant gathering courage, and said, Forgive me, Your Majesty. I don't speak of it. The memory is unkind. She felt him studying her. Then, unexpectedly, he said, That I understand. And there was something in those 3 words that did not sound like a hook at all, something older and rougher, and it unsettled her more than the questions had. The boots moved on. The door closed. Grace let out a breath and found that her hands, her famous steady hands, were trembling against her apron. It became a pattern, and the pattern became a war, though only the 2 of them knew it was being fought. He was present far too often. Kings did not haunt their own hallways, yet Ethan Cole seemed to appear wherever she worked, reading by windows she had to pass, taking his correspondence in rooms whose fires she tended, dictating letters to his secretary while she changed the linens 2 doors down with her pulse roaring in her ears. And always the questions came, dropped like coins into still water, one at a time, gentle, patient, relentless. Where in the north, exactly? What had her husband done? How had she learned her letters? For he had noticed, he said, that she read the labels on the linen shelves too quickly for a village widow. What had brought her to the capital of all places, so far from home? Grace parried every one. She had built her false life carefully, and she inhabited it fully, the way an actor inhabits a role, but he was unlike any audience she had ever faced. He listened to her answers with his head very slightly tilted, as if he were listening to something underneath the words, and twice she caught the ghost of an expression on his face that terrified her, precisely because it was not suspicion. It was fascination. And she, heaven help her, was fascinated back, and she hated herself for it. Because the cold king of Molly's gossip, the storm cloud, the man of winter stone, did not quite match the man she watched from beneath her lowered lashes. She saw him dismiss a duke's flattering letter with dry contempt, then spend an hour on a petition from a village about a broken bridge. She saw him stand at the gallery window at dusk, when he thought no one watched, with a stillness that was not coldness at all, but something much lonelier. She heard him laugh exactly once, at some remark of Captain Hart's, a short, startled sound, as if his own laughter had ambushed him, and Grace found herself smiling behind her veil, before she caught herself and scrubbed the smile away like a stain. Worse, far worse, was what happened inside her when he stood too near. Her own wolf, the quiet, cautious creature she had kept leashed and hidden for 6 years, had begun to stir. It rose toward him like a plant toward light. It pulled at her when he entered a room, and ached when he left, and it whispered a word she refused, absolutely refused, to hear. The herbs. Everything depended on the herbs, and the herbs were failing. Not all at once. But daily closeness was a slow fire, and twice in one terrible week she saw the proof. The first time, she was leaning to gather cups from a table when he passed behind her, and he stopped mid-sentence to his secretary, simply stopped, and stood for 3 full seconds with his eyes closed, and when he resumed the sentence, his voice was almost right. Almost. The second time was in the narrow service stair, an accident of timing, the two of them alone, passing within arm's reach. She pressed herself to the wall, head down. He went by her. 1 step, 2, and then his hand caught the rail and gripped it until his knuckles went white, and he said, very quietly, not to her, not to anyone, "What are you?" Grace fled down the stairs like a proper frightened servant, and that night, she sat on her cot, with her little wooden herb box open in her lap, and did the arithmetic of survival. Triple doses now. The box would be empty in 12 days. Buying more in the city meant a trip through gates that watched her, in markets where a veiled woman asking for masking herbs might as well ring a bell. And even triple doses were only just holding, because whatever was happening between her body and that man's presence was not a smell that herbs could smother. It was a tide. 12 days, she thought. In 12 days I take the pouch and I go. Suspicion or no suspicion, riders or no riders. Better hunted in the open country than unmasked in a locked palace. She had, as it turned out, 5. Because on the 5th day, as she carried folded linens along the great corridor toward the king's council chamber, she heard the voices of arriving guests, echoing up the marble stair. A rival faction's delegation come to negotiate borders, and beneath the perfume and the politics of them, her wolf caught something that made it snarl in the dark of her, something oiled and cold and wrong. Steel. Hidden steel, where no guest steel should be. And the council chamber doors were opening, and Ethan Cole was rising from his chair to greet his guests, unarmed, unwarned, with a smile of state on his face, and his back to the tall windows, and Grace Holloway stood in the corridor with an armful of linens, and a heartbeat in which to decide who she was. The linens hit the floor before Grace even knew she had dropped them. Afterward, when she tried to remember the order of things, it came back to her only in flashes. The delegation, bowing in the doorway of the council chamber. The third man among them, a narrow fellow in a merchant's coat, sliding 1 step wide of his companions, his hand crossing his body toward his sleeve, the bright, thin length of steel coming free, the king turning toward his guests with his arms open in formal welcome, seeing it half a second too late, and half a second, in matters of knives, is the whole world. And her own body, moving. She did not decide it. That was the truth she would wrestle with for weeks afterward, in the dark, alone. There was no moment where Grace Holloway weighed her freedom against a king's life and chose. There was only the surge, her wolf rising through her like a flood through a broken dam, and the corridor blurring, and then she was between them, between the blade and the man, her arm sweeping the assassin's wrist aside with a strength that shocked all 3 of them. The steel scored a hot line along her forearm instead of finding the king's heart. Then the room exploded. Guards poured in from both doors, shouting. The delegation scattered like startled birds. The narrow man fought like a cornered animal, for exactly 4 seconds, before Captain Hart drove him to the marble, and pinned him there. Chairs went over. Somewhere a counselor was screaming for healers, for chains, for the gates to be sealed. Grace stood swaying in the middle of it, her arm burning, her breath ragged, and slowly understood 3 things in order of increasing horror. Her sleeve was soaked red. Her veil was gone, torn away in the struggle, lying on the marble like a shed gray skin, and the winter light from the tall windows was falling directly on her uncovered face, on the scars that ran along her jaw and down her neck, and a dozen strangers were staring at her. And the herbs had failed, completely. She could feel it happening, feel the heat of effort and fear steaming her own scent up off her skin, in waves. Rain and jasmine filling the wrecked chamber, unmistakable, undeniable, and the man behind her had gone utterly still. She turned. She could not help it. For the first time since entering this palace, Grace Holloway looked directly at the Alpha King, and the Alpha King looked directly at her. She saw the moment it happened. She watched his gaze move across her bared face, not flinching from the scars, barely pausing on them, and then his nostrils flared, and his eyes changed, the gray of them turning molten, and his lips parted, and the word that came out of him was low and rough and wrecked, a word she had spent 6 years running from, without ever knowing its shape. You? The room was chaos, and shouting, and the room did not exist. He took 1 step toward her. His hand came up, slowly, the way a man reaches toward something he is afraid will vanish if he moves too fast. And every instinct in Grace screamed in 2 opposite directions at once, toward him and away, away, away. Her knees chose that moment to give out. Blood loss is patient, but it always collects. The floor tilted, and instead of marble she met his arms, because he had crossed the space between them faster than sight, and she was caught against the chest of the most dangerous man in the world, while his heart hammered under her ear like a war drum, and his wolf's presence rolled over her, vast and shaking. "Healer," he said, over her head, in a voice that stopped every other voice in the room. "Now." "Your Majesty," someone protested. "The assassin, the delegation. We must secure your person. Protocol demands. Now." Grace floated somewhere between the burning in her arm and the impossible warmth of being held. Some distant, still functioning part of her mind, the survivor part, the part that had kept her alive for 6 years, was speaking to her calmly through the fog. "Look at what surrounds you," it said. "Guards, counselors, witnesses. Your face is bare. Your scent is loose in the room like spilled wine. Within the hour, someone in this palace will begin asking who the veiled girl really was, and they will pull that thread, and the thread goes all the way to Ashmore. You cannot outrun this anymore. You can only choose how it is told, and by whom." "Tell it yourself," said the survivor. "Tell it first. It is the only power you have left." The king was lowering her onto a bench. His hand was pressed hard over the wound in her forearm, slowing the bleeding, and he was looking at her face the way a starving man looks at bread, and he was saying something, her false name, "Grace, Grace, stay with me." And even half fainting, she heard how strange her own name sounded in his mouth, like a key trying the wrong lock. She gathered every scrap of strength she had left. She reached up with her good hand, and gripped the front of his coat, and pulled him down toward her, and the mighty Alpha King came, instantly, bending to a laundry girl's hand in front of his entire council. "Not Miller," she whispered. He went still. "What?" "My name," Grace said, and her voice was thread-thin, but perfectly clear, and she watched his eyes as she laid down the last card she owned, the one that would either save her or bury her. "Is not Grace Miller. My name is Grace Holloway, daughter of Richard Holloway, of the Ashmore Pack." She saw the name strike him. She saw him recognize it, saw 5 years of court judgments and traitor lists and burned territories move behind his eyes like storm shadow, saw his hands tighten on her, though whether to hold her or hold on to her she could not tell. "Now you know," she breathed, "why I hid." And then, because her body had given absolutely everything it had, the light folded up around the edges, and the last things Grace knew were the roar of the council chamber erupting into uproar, a dozen voices shouting the word Ashmore, and the word traitor, and the word arrest, and above them all, cutting through them like a blade through wet paper, the voice of the king saying a single word, no, and the strange, terrifying safety of not being let go. She woke in a room she did not know, in a bed too soft to be a servant's, with her arm bandaged in clean white linen, and winter sunlight lying across a floor far too fine. Her veil was folded on the table beside her. Someone had washed the blood from her hands. And in a chair by the window, watching her with gray eyes that had clearly not closed all night, sat Ethan Cole. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Her scent filled the room, unhidden for the first time in 6 years, and she saw what it was doing to him, saw the fight in him between the king and the wolf, and she understood with a sinking heart that whatever came next, the running was over. He knew her face. He knew her name. He knew what she was to him, and she could see he knew. It was written in every taut line of the man. "The council," he said at last, quietly, "met through the night. They have voted, 7-2, that the fugitive daughter of the traitor Richard Holloway be taken to the cells to await judgment under the old law." Grace's stomach dropped through the fine floor. And I refused. You cannot simply refuse a lawful counsel. "I invoked mate right," said the king. The words landed in the room like a thrown torch. Grace sat up too fast, her arms screaming, her heart screaming louder. "You did what?" "It is the one law older than theirs." His voice was level, but his eyes were not. Nothing about his eyes was level. No power in the United Pacts may imprison, harm, or remove an alpha's recognized mate without his consent. "I recognized you before the full council at dawn. You are under my protection, in my wing, by my word." A pause, and then, softer, rougher, the king cracking to show the man, "You are safe."
"Safe!"
Grace repeated. She looked at the beautiful room, the guarded door, the man between her and the world, and she heard the truth beneath the mercy, and 6 years of rage rose in her throat and finally came out. "You have not saved me, your majesty! You have changed my cell for a nicer one!" "And you should know, before this goes one step further, that of every man alive, I would have chosen anyone but you. Your court signed the lie that ruined my family. Your law calls my dead father a traitor. And your protection," her voice broke and she hated it, "your protection is chains with velvet on them." Silence. She expected anger. Kings did not hear such words twice. Instead, Ethan Cole looked at her for a long, unbearable moment, and then said the very last thing she was prepared for. "Then tell me what really happened at Ashmore. Because I have read every page of that judgment this night, Grace Holloway, and I no longer believe a word of it." The council chamber had been repaired within a day, but the kingdom itself was cracking, and everyone in the palace could hear it. By the end of the week, there was no servant, guard, or noble in the capital who had not heard the story. The Alpha King, the man of winter stone, the king who had sent home the daughters of 40 noble houses, had claimed a mate at last, and his mate was a scarred fugitive from the most cursed pack in living memory. Half the city called it a scandal. The other half called it treason wearing a wedding veil. In the noble quarters, old men who had grown rich on Ashmore's carved-up lands began to meet behind closed doors, and their meetings did not sound like celebrations. Grace heard all of it, because Molly still came to her, the only person in the palace who treated her exactly as before, marching past the tower guards with bread hidden in her apron, and gossip spilling out of her like grain from a torn sack. "They're afraid of you," Molly reported, wide-eyed, perched on the edge of a chair, far too grand for either of them. "The lords, you should hear them." Elder Crane stood up in open council and said the king had been bewitched, that scent trickery was a known art of the old Ashmore line. "Bewitched," he said, "like you're something out of a fireside story." Edmund Crane said that. Grace kept her voice flat, but the name went through her like cold water. She remembered it from her childhood, distantly, a colleague of her father's, a smiling man at festival tables. He had sat on the tribunal that condemned her family. He now held, Molly confirmed cheerfully, the largest single portion of the old Ashmore territory, granted to him by that same tribunal for his services to justice. "Interesting," said the survivor's voice in the back of Grace's mind, quiet and cold. "Isn't that interesting?" Her days had settled into the strangest shape her life had ever taken. She was neither prisoner nor guest. neither servant nor lady. She had rooms in the north wing, guards whose bows were half respect and half surveillance, fine clothes she refused to wear, and a standing daily invitation to dine with the king, which she had declined 11 days in a row. It had become a battle of wills conducted through the palace staff. Each evening his steward arrived to ask. Each evening, she said, "Tell His Majesty I have already eaten." Each evening, an hour later, a covered tray came up from his own kitchen anyway, and each evening she was too hungry and too practical to refuse the food, which annoyed her beyond words, because it meant he was winning in a small way, and he knew it. Yet on the 12th day it was not the steward who knocked, it was Ethan himself, alone, carrying, of all things in the world, a wooden document box under one arm, and his expression was not the expression of a suitor, it was the expression of a man, carrying something heavy. "Not dinner," he said, before she could speak. "Work. May I come in?" He set the box on her table and opened it, and Grace looked down at her family's death. The complete record of the Ashmore judgment, the tribunal transcripts, the evidence lists, the letters, the ones supposedly found in her father's own study, in her father's own hand, offering the rogue pack safe passage through Ashmore lands in exchange for gold, the letters that had turned a loyal border pack into a nation of traitors overnight. "I have read all of it 4 times now," Ethan said. "I was crowned 2 years after the judgment. I inherited it as settled history, and I never questioned it, and that is my failure to carry. But I am questioning it now, and I need the one witness no tribunal ever called." He looked at her. "You were there. Walk me through that night. Everything you remember, however small." Grace stood very still. 6 years she had carried that night sealed inside her, because remembering it was like swallowing fire, and no one, not one soul in the world, had ever asked for the truth of it. Accusation, she knew how to survive. This quiet, terrible invitation, undid her more than any interrogation could have. So she told him, standing at the window with her back half turned, in a voice she kept flat because flat was the only way through it. She told him about the horns at midnight, the strangers already inside the walls before any alarm was raised, which no one had ever explained, about her father running not for the border, as a guilty man would, but toward the great hall, shouting for the pack records, the ledgers, the correspondence, as if he knew that what was about to be destroyed was proof of something, about the doors of their family house that would not open, though they had opened every day of her life, and the smell of oil in the smoke, and hands, at the last moment, unknown hands, dragging her through a window into the dark. "The fire did not spread to our house," she finished. "It started there. Whoever came that night came first, for my father's papers and my father's family. The rogues stole nothing and held nothing. They burned specific buildings and left. Rogue raids are famine, wearing knives, Your Majesty. They take grain, cattle, coin. This one took only evidence and reputations, and within a year, the lands of the convicted traitor had been lawfully distributed to the very men who convicted him." The room was silent. When she finally turned, Ethan was not looking at the documents. He was looking at her, and his eyes held something she had never seen aimed at her family in 6 years, and it took her a moment to recognize it, because she had stopped believing it existed. Belief. "The letters," he said at last, quietly. "The ones in your father's hand. I had a scribe of my own. Examine them this week, against tax rolls. Your father signed in earlier years. Documents stored in the capital, beyond any northern lord's reach." He drew 2 pages from the box, and laid them side by side. "The hand is skilled, almost perfect, but your father crossed his letters with a rising stroke, all his life, in every genuine signature we hold. The traitor's letters cross falling, every single one. A forger copies shapes, Grace. He cannot copy 30 years of habit." Grace looked at the 2 pages, at the small, rising, familiar stroke of her father's living hand, and something inside her that had been clenched for 6 years began, very dangerously, to shake loose. She pressed her fingers flat on the table to keep them still. "Then someone built all of it," she said. "The letters, the raid, the fire, the tribunal. Someone with reach inside the palace and inside the north. Someone who profited." She raised her eyes. "You know the pattern of it as well as I do, Your Majesty. You lived it. Someone close, trusted, patient, selling the people who trusted them. Your fiancée worked 5 years beside you before you saw her. She watched the blow land, and she had meant it to land, and to her surprise, he did not close against it. He nodded slowly, like a man accepting a debt. Yes, he said, which is why I will not repeat my mistake of trusting the official story. He began returning the papers to the box, and his voice dropped into something quieter and harder. The voice, she realized, of the man who had won the Rogue Wars. From tonight, this investigation exists nowhere on paper and in only 3 heads: yours, mine, and Daniel Hart's. Because if we are right, the man who destroyed Ashmore has sat above suspicion for 6 years, dines in this palace weekly, and has already tried to put steel in me once. Grace went cold. The assassin. You think it was? The man has said nothing in his cell but one thing, over and over, that he was paid by a northern voice through a southern purse. Ethan closed the box. Elder Edmund Crane holds the north. And Elder Edmund Crane has spent this entire week telling my council, most persuasively, that you have bewitched me, and that the safest cure for the kingdom would be your quiet removal. He looked up, and for a moment, the king and the wolf were the same creature, and it was not a safe creature at all. He is moving against you because you are the last living thread to what he buried, which means, Grace Holloway, that you are also the thread that can unravel him, if you are willing to be pulled. Outside the tall windows, snow had begun to fall on the palace of her enemy, which was becoming, in a way that terrified her more than any cell, something else entirely. Grace looked at the box that held her father's stolen name, and then at the man offering to help her steal it back. Pull, she said. The hunt for Edmund Crane's secrets began in a wine cellar at 2 in the morning, because that was where Daniel Hart had hidden the clerk. The clerk's name was Peter Finch, a small, gray, terrified man who had spent 20 years keeping accounts in the Northern Land Office, and who had walked into a palace guard post 3 nights earlier, asking for protection, in exchange for what he knew. Crane's people were already searching for him. Daniel had moved him 4 times in 3 days. Grace went down to the cellar with the king himself, both of them cloaked and hooded like thieves in their own castle, and listened while Finch, sweating in the lamplight, laid out 6 years of careful theft. The Ashmore grants were rigged before the tribunal ever sat, Finch whispered. I copied the documents myself. May I be forgiven. The land surveys dividing the territory were dated 3 weeks before the raid. Before, my lord. Before anyone was supposed to know Ashmore would fall. Crane's office had the maps of the traitor's lands drawn while the traitor was still alive and loyal and had committed no crime at all. Grace felt the words physically, like pressure on her chest. Beside her, the king's voice stayed perfectly level. Can you prove the dates? The originals are in Crane's private archive at his northern estate, but there is a duplicate set. Finch wiped his face. Crane is careful, but the land office requires sealed copies of all surveys, and those copies sit in the Crown's own registry, here, in this palace. 3 floors above your head, filed under harmless numbers no one has looked at in 6 years. He could not remove them without leaving a gap in the ledgers, so he simply trusted that no one would ever have a reason to look. He was nearly right, said Ethan. Thank you, Master Finch. You will find the Crown remembers its friends. They looked that same night. Grace, who read too quickly for a village widow, and the king of the United Pacts, side by side, in the dusty registry with a shaded lamp, pulling ledgers until dawn, and there it was, exactly where a gray little clerk had promised. Survey commissions for the division of Ashmore territory, sealed, stamped, and dated 20 days before the raid. Crane's own signature at the bottom, crossed with a confident falling stroke. Grace stared at that signature for a long time. The letters, she said slowly. The forged letters that condemned my father. The falling stroke. Your scribe said the forger crossed his letters falling. She set the survey beside her memory of those pages, and the cellar cold of the registry seemed to deepen. He wrote them himself. He did not even hire it out. He sat down and wrote my family's death in his own hand, and then he sat on the tribunal and wept. They told me he wept, for the tragedy of northern treachery. Something touched her shoulder, his hand. Just that, just weight and warmth, and he said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and it was somehow exactly right, and Grace stood in the dust and the lamplight and let herself lean, 1 inch, for 1 moment, against the strength of him. 1 inch. It shook her more than the documents did. They built the case through the deep of winter, in stolen hours, in silence. Daniel Hart traced the assassin's southern purse backward, through 3 money changers, until it touched a shipping house that existed on paper only, and whose registered agent had, years earlier, managed accounts for the Crane estates. Finch, from his cellar, decoded ledger after ledger, and Grace found she had a gift for the work, for holding 100 small details in her head at once, for smelling the wrongness in a neat page, and if some part of her noticed that she had stopped counting the coins under her floorboard, had stopped studying the southern roads, she did not examine that part too closely. She was too busy noticing him. It happened gradually, and then all at once, the way ice breaks. The evenings of work stretched longer. The silences grew comfortable, and then more than comfortable. He argued with her, genuinely argued, listened when she cut his reasoning apart, and changed his mind out loud when she was right, and she learned that nothing in 6 years had made her feel more like a person than being disagreed with honestly. She learned the small human seams of him, that he took his tea plain, because a spy had once been caught through a poisoned sugar bowl, that he could name every soldier he had lost in the war, and did, alone, every year on midwinter night. And one evening she heard herself laugh at something dry he said, laugh fully, and realized it was the first time she had heard her own real laugh since she was 16. The veil came off on the night they finished the ledger work. It was late. The fire had burned low. He had never once asked about the veil, not since that first week, had treated it as simply part of her, and perhaps that was why. Grace stood by the fire, and her hands rose, and she unpinned the gray cloth and let it fall, and turned her bare face fully into the light, scars and all, and looked at him. Not because she had to, because she chose to, for the first time in her life. Ethan Cole put down his pen. He crossed the room slowly, the way he did everything that mattered, giving her a whole world of time to step back. She did not step back. He raised his hand, and traced, with unbearable gentleness, the line of the scar along her jaw, the mark of the fire Edmund Crane had set, and then he bent his head, and pressed his lips to it, to the ruined skin she had hidden from the world for 6 years, and against her scar he said, quietly, "There you are." Grace closed her eyes. Inside her, her wolf finally said the word she had been refusing to hear since a cold wind crossed a laundry yard, and this time she did not argue. They should have had 1 more week. The case needed 1 more week, Daniel had said, 1 more link in the money chain, and then it would be seamless, undeniable, ready to lay before the full council, with Crane sitting in his chair with nowhere on earth to go. Crane did not give them the week. Whether it was a bribed registry guard, or the fourth moving of a frightened clerk noticed by the wrong eyes, or simply the animal instinct of a predator who has survived by smelling hunters, they never fully learned. But on the first morning of the thaw, the great council was barely seated, the king's agenda barely opened, when Elder Edmund Crane rose from his chair, silver-haired, sorrowful, magnificent, and addressed the chamber in the rolling voice of a man performing grief. "My lords, it pains me beyond words to raise what I must raise. Our king, whom I have served faithfully since before his crowning, has been ensnared. The woman he shields in his own wing is the daughter of proven treason, and now we learn she creeps by night through crown archives, unpicking the settled judgments of this realm, to resurrect her father's lies. I make no accusation against his majesty. A bewitched man is a victim, not a criminal. But this council has a duty older than any king's affection." He paused, and his gaze crossed the chamber, and found Grace where she stood, and behind the sorrow of his face she saw, for one flickering instant, the cold thing that had signed her family's death, seeing her, measuring her, unafraid. "Therefore I invoke the old law," said Edmund Crane. "The trial of the moon. If this woman would stand beside our king, let her stand before the moon herself, in the sight of every pack, on the open ground, as every true Luna of the old blood once did. Let the moon judge what she is." He spread his hands with terrible gentleness. "And if the moon turns her face away, as she turns from all deceivers, then let the law take its ancient course, and let no man, not even a king, stand in its way." The chamber erupted, and through the roar, Grace understood the trap in all its beauty. Refuse, and confirm every whisper, and lose the council, and doom them both. Accept, and stand unveiled before the assembled kingdom, in a rite no one had survived in 4 generations. A rite designed and staged and judged by men who needed her to fail. Ethan was on his feet, fury rolling off him, and she knew he was one breath from burning his own crown to shield her, and she knew exactly what that would cost him. And the survivor in her, the cold, clear voice that had carried her through fire and 6 hunted years, spoke one last time. "They have made the whole kingdom your witness," it said. "Good. Truth dies in cellars. Let it stand in the open." Grace Holloway stepped forward, into the center of the chamber, unveiled before them all, and heard her own voice ring off the marble, steady as her hands. "I accept." They gave her 9 days to prepare for a trial no living person had witnessed, and Edmund Crane spent all 9 of them, making sure she could not. The rules of the Trial of the Moon existed in exactly one place, the Book of the First Pax, kept under triple lock in the temple archive, and Crane, as senior elder, controlled access to the temple archive. The copy delivered to Grace's rooms on the 2nd day was missing 4 pages. She knew because the page numbers jumped, an error so lazy it was almost an insult, and when Ethan sent Daniel to demand the complete text, the temple keepers wrung their hands and spoke of the fragility of ancient bindings and promised to look into it, and looked into it for 6 irreplaceable days. "He is not trying to test you," Ethan said on the 3rd night, pacing her room like a storm in boots. "He is building a stage for your failure. The rite has 3 parts, that much is common lore. The bearing, the asking, and the answer. The missing pages will describe exactly what the bearing and the asking require, and on the night, you will stand ignorant in front of 50,000 people, while his temple keepers spring requirements on you that no one could meet unprepared. And the answer." He stopped pacing. "The answer is the moons alone. No one in 4 generations has received one. The last 3 women who stood the trial stood in silence until the crowd itself judged them, and the crowds were merciful in none of the 3 stories. Then we stop treating it as a rite," Grace said, "and start treating it as him. He designed this trap in 9 days, using the tools he had. So the trap is made of the same materials as everything else he has ever built: paper, fear, and other people's assumptions." She pulled a chair to the table. "Sit down, Your Majesty. You have read every page of my family's destruction 4 times. Now we read his." It was Molly in the end who found the thread. Molly, who could not read law but could read people, who sat in on their councils now with bread in her apron and had long stopped being surprised by anything, said one evening, "If the old book is the only copy, how do the temple keepers practice?" My gran was a temple sweeper in the West. She always said the keepers drill the great rites every midsummer so they won't stumble if one's ever called. Drills mean instructions. Instructions mean somebody wrote a crib sheet. Daniel Hart found the drill manual 30 hours later, in the temple's own lesson chests, uncontrolled, unlocked, and complete. Because Edmund Crane in all his brilliance had guarded the sacred book and never once thought about the servants. Grace read the 4 suppressed pages at last, and then she read them again, and she began, slowly, to smile, and the smile had teeth. "The bearing," she said. "The candidate must carry the moon basin from the temple door to the high stone, alone, without setting it down, and stand it on the altar unspilled. The basin is bronze, filled with water, and weighs as much as a half-grown child. That is why they starve the candidate first. The fasting is in the open rules. Everyone knows the Luna fasts, 3 days before the rite. A noble daughter raised on cushions, fasting 3 days, drops the basin in front of the world, and the moon has judged her weak." She looked up. "I have hauled double wash loads up the yard stairs since I was 17, on servants' meals. Let him starve me. I could carry his basin to the border." The asking, Ethan read over her shoulder. "The candidate is questioned before the crowd by the senior elder, and must answer every question truly, for the moon hears all falsehood." His jaw set. "An open stage for Crane to gut you in public. He will ask about your name, your lies, your forged papers, 6 years of hiding, and every true answer will sound like a confession." "Yes," said Grace softly. "Every true answer. He has forgotten something, Ethan." It was the first time she had ever used his name, and it stopped him completely, and she let it. He is used to opponents with secrets, because he has never fought anyone whose secrets he did not write himself. "But you unpicked mine in an archive at midnight weeks ago. I have nothing left to hide. So he will stand in front of 50,000 people, and he will ask me questions, And I will answer every single one truly. And the truth is not my confession. She laid her hand flat on the drill manual. It is his. The night of the trial came clear and bitterly cold, with a full moon rising white over the sacred field beyond the city walls, and the field was black with people. 50,000, Daniel had estimated, and he had estimated low. Every pack had sent thousands. They ringed the long white processional path in torchlight, packed slope to slope, and at the path's end, the high stone waited, ancient and bare under the open sky, and beside it, in robes of ceremonial silver, stood Edmund Crane, sorrowful and magnificent, master of the stage he had built. Grace stood at the temple door in the plain white shift of the candidate, 3 days empty, unveiled, her scars bare to the torchlight and the cold, and the eyes of a nation. Behind her, breaking every protocol of the rite, the Alpha King stood as close as the temple line allowed, and what rolled off him was not calm. Whatever happens on that stone, he said, low, for her alone, you do not stand there as one woman. You are the last of Ashmore, and you are my mate, and both of those bloodlines are done kneeling. Grace looked down the white path, at the sea of torches, at the silver figure waiting by the stone with 6 years of buried fire behind his gentle face. Her heart was slamming, her hands were steady. Watch him, not me, she murmured. When it turns, it will turn fast. Then the temple horns sounded, long and low across the freezing field, and 50,000 people fell silent all at once, and Grace Holloway lifted the bronze basin, brimming with moonlit water, feeling its brutal weight settle into arms that had earned their strength in the enemy's own laundry, and stepped out alone onto the white stones to face the man who had burned her family, with nothing in her hands but water, and nothing in her mouth but the truth. The basin fought her from the first step. The drill manual had told her the weight, but no page could describe the way the water moved, alive and treacherous, swinging its mass against her arms with every stride, hunting for the one stumble that would end everything. The white path was 400 paces long. The cold bit through the thin shift. 3 days of fasting had hollowed her, and by the 100th pace, her shoulders were burning, and by the 200th, the burn had become a scream, and the torchlit crowd was a blurred, roaring silence on either side. 50,000 held breaths. But her body had spent 6 years learning one lesson above all others, and the lesson was this: pain is only information, and information can wait. She had carried water up the yard stairs with cracked hands. She had worked fevers through to sundown, because missing wages meant missing the border. She fixed her eyes on the high stone and let the pain wait, step after step after step, and when her foot found the altar platform at last, and she raised the bronze basin, arms shaking, and set it on the ancient stone with not one drop spilled, the sound that came off the field was like the sea striking a cliff. Edmund Crane's face performed pleased surprise beautifully, only his eyes recalculated. The moon has seen the bearing, he announced to the field, his trained voice rolling across the silence. Now comes the asking. Candidate, you stand before the moon and the packs, and you are bound to truth. Do you understand that every falsehood spoken on this stone condemns you? I understand, said Grace, and found that the field's silence carried her voice further than she had dreamed. I welcome it. He began gently, as skilled butchers do. Was her name Grace Miller? No, she answered. That name was false. My true name is Grace Holloway of Ashmore. Had she forged papers to enter the king's service? Yes. Had she lied to the crown's own guards, to the steward, to the household, for months? Yes, yes, and yes. Each admission fell into the crowd like a stone into deep water, and she felt the mood of the field shifting, darkening, and she saw Crane feel it too, saw him warm to his work, sorrowful and relentless. You confess freely to a life built of lies, he said. Tell the packs then, why? Why does an innocent woman erase her face, her name, her very scent, and burrow into the household of the king himself? And there it was. The door he thought was a gallows, and was in fact a gate, and he had opened it himself in front of the entire world. Because 6 years ago, said Grace Holloway, a man I am looking at right now, burned my family alive in our home, and stole everything we had, and I was 16, and hiding was the only way to survive him. The field did not roar this time. It went deathly, perfectly still, 50,000 people leaning in as one. Crane's sorrow held, masterfully. Grief invents demons, child. The tribunal was chaired by you. I am bound to truth on this stone, elder, so let me be exact. Her voice rang like struck bronze, and the fasting and the cold were gone, burned away by something that had waited 6 years for open ground. The surveys dividing my father's lands among the tribunal's members were commissioned by your office and sealed into the Crown Registry 20 days before the raid you called unforeseeable. The letters that condemned my father crossed their strokes falling, as your hand does, though his rose for 30 years in every genuine record the Crown holds. The man who carried steel into the King's Council chamber this winter was paid, by his own testimony, through a southern shipping house whose agent kept your accounts. Duplicate proofs of all of it lie tonight before the Crown. In the registry your own signature could not be removed from without leaving a hole. She turned from him then, deliberately, and gave the field her scarred face, turning slowly, so the torchlight found every line of it. You asked me why I hid. I stand before the moon, bound to truth, and answer. I hid from him, and I am finished hiding. What happened next happened in 3 heartbeats. In the first heartbeat, Edmund Crane looked at the crowd, and the crowd looked back at him, and 6 years of magnificent performance met 50,000 pairs of eyes that had just stopped believing it, and he understood, with the pure cold clarity that had made him so dangerous for so long, that the stage was lost. In the second heartbeat, he stopped performing. It was the most terrible thing Grace had ever seen, the sorrow simply draining out of that silver face, like water from a cracked basin, leaving what had always lived underneath. And in the third he raised his hand, and from the darkness beyond the torch ring, where the temple's ceremonial grounds met the black winter fields, came the sound Grace would hear in her dreams for years. The long, rising howls of rogue packs breaking from cover, hundreds of them, answering a signal 6 years in the arranging, because Edmund Crane was careful, and careful men who build gallows also build doors, and his door had always been fire. So the moon judges, he said quietly, to her alone, in the voice of the thing beneath the face. Then let her judge everyone. The edges of the great field erupted. Screams tore across the slopes as dark shapes crashed into the outermost torch lines, and 50,000 people surged like a struck ocean, and Grace, on the high stone at the center of it all, saw the shape of the true plan at last, and it was worse than a trial rigged to fail. It had never mattered to Crane whether she passed or fell. She had been bait. Every high family, every pack leader, every council member, and the king himself, gathered by sacred law onto one open field at night, ringed by hills, far from the city walls. Her trial was the trap, and the kingdom had walked into it, and its jaws were closing from every side. Through the boiling chaos she found the one still point, as she somehow had known she would. Ethan, at the temple line, already turned toward the attack, already roaring commands that cut through panic like a blade through wet paper, guards flowing to him, out of the crowd, forming, wheeling. His eyes found hers across 400 paces of erupting field, one look, half a second, and in it, an entire conversation. Stay on the stone. Never, she answered, and something that was fear and pride and love, all fused into a single unbearable thing, and then the wave of battle broke between them, and he was gone into it. Grace turned back to Edmund Crane and found him watching her, calm amid the storm he had called, drawing from beneath his silver robes the thin ceremonial blade of the senior elder, which she understood, with cold clarity, had never been ceremonial to him at all. You should have stayed a rumor girl, he said. Grace Holloway stood on the high stone of her ancestors, 3 days empty, unarmed, alone, with the mate bond blazing in her chest, and her family's fire in front of her wearing a man's shape, and she felt her wolf rise through her like the tide, and for the first time in 6 years, she let it come all the way. You should have checked the doors, she said, before you lit the match. Crane came at her fast, for a man of 60, and Grace understood in the first exchange that she was fighting the person he had hidden longest of all. The world believed Edmund Crane was a man of ledgers and speeches. The blade in his hand said otherwise, said it in quick, economical arcs that had been drilled somewhere far from any council chamber, and Grace gave ground across the altar platform, weaving, using the great bronze basin and the high stone itself as her shield, her fasted body running on nothing now but wolf and will. 6 years, Crane said, conversational, even as he cut the air where her shoulder had been. 6 years. I wondered if a Holloway had slipped the fire. One small girl. One loose end. Another arc. She caught his wrist on the swing, and he broke the grip with vicious skill, and forced her back to the stone's very edge. Do you know what your father found, in the end? Shall I tell you, since we are being truthful tonight? He found my accounts. 15 years of them. He came to me first, the fool, as a friend, to give me a chance to explain, before he went to the crown. The blade flashed. Fire kissed her upper arm. Shallow. Hot. I thanked him for his loyalty. And then I solved him. He was talking to unmake her, she knew it, feeding her rage, because rage stumbles, and the terrible thing was that it was working. 6 years of grief rising in her like a red tide, and then, through the roar of the battle below, and the roar of her own blood, Grace heard the one sound that cut through both. A howl. His howl. Ethan, somewhere in the boiling dark below the stone, and threaded through the fury of it, the bond itself, and down that bond, came not comfort, but something infinitely more useful. Cold. Battle cold, the gift of a man who had survived 5 years of war and one great betrayal, flowing into her like ice water. Grief stumbles, said the cold. Grief is for after. Watch his feet. She watched his feet. And she saw it, the pattern her rage had blinded her to, that Crane fought like his conspiracies, always the feint toward the visible target, always the true stroke arriving from the trusted side. The blade dipped toward her wounded arm. She moved as if deceived, and when the real cut came whistling for the other side, she was not there. She was inside it, both hands closing on his sword arm, and she turned with the whole force of her body, with wash-yard shoulders and basin-bearing arms, and 6 years of carried weight. And Edmund Crane's own momentum carried him past her, and the ancient bronze basin of the moon met him at the end of his arc, with a sound like a temple bell. The blade rang away across the stones. The senior elder of the United Packs folded to the altar floor, conscious, gasping, finished, and Grace stood over him with his own ceremonial blade now in her hand, her chest heaving, her arm bleeding, the red tide screaming in her ears for an ending. He looked up at her, and even now, even broken on the stone with his life in her grip, the thing beneath his face calculated. Go on then, he rasped. Do it in front of them all. Show the Packs what Ashmore blood does. Prove the tribunal right. And there, on the ground, was his very last trap, laid with his very last breath of power, and Grace looked at it for one long, shaking moment, and then she stepped back from it. No, she said. You do not get to write one more line of my family's story. She raised her voice, and it carried, because the battle below had turned, was turning, the rogue assault breaking against a defense that fought like a single creature around a king, who fought like the end of the world, and the field was beginning to listen again. This man will live. He will live to stand where he made others stand, before the law, with his 15 years of accounts read aloud, every page, every name. That is the sentence he has spent his whole life fearing, more than any blade. Bind him. It was Daniel Hart who reached the stone first, bloodied, limping, grinning through it, with a squad at his back, and it was Daniel who bound the elder's hands, and Grace would remember all her life, that as the guards raised Crane up, his silver robes torn, and his mask gone forever, the first pale light of dawn was coming up over the sacred field, and the fighting had guttered out across the slopes, and 50,000 people who had come to watch a trial stood in the wreckage of a war, staring up at the high stone in absolute silence, staring at her. She became aware, slowly, of what they were seeing. A scarred woman in a blood-stained white shift, the confessed liar, the traitor's daughter, standing over the true traitor of the age, with his blade surrendered in her open hand, and his conspiracy broken at her feet. And then she became aware of something else, something impossible, and the crowd became aware of it in the same heartbeat, a murmur rolling across the field like wind through wheat, thousands of faces turning upward, and Grace looked up too. The full moon, which should have been setting pale and spent into the dawn, stood above the high stone burning silver, and the light around Grace was not dawn light. It fell on her alone, on the stone alone, a column of white radiance out of the oldest stories, the light no living person had seen, the light the temple books called simply the answer. Warmth moved through her, through her wounds, through her scars, through the 6 hollow years, and deep within her she felt her wolf rise up into that light, and be seen, entirely, at last. And somewhere in the vast silence below, one voice began the old cry, and then 1,000, and then the whole shaking field. The moon has answered, the moon has answered. Luna, Luna, Luna. Grace Holloway stood in the impossible light and wept without shame in front of 50,000 people, and then the light gentled and faded into ordinary dawn, and the crowd's roar crashed over the field like a breaking sea, and she looked down from the stone and saw one man walking up the white path toward her through it all, torn and bloodied from the battle, his eyes fixed on her like she was the only fixed point in creation. Ethan reached the stone. He looked at her for a long moment, at the blood and the scars and the tear streaks and the surrendered blade still in her hand, and then the Alpha King of the United Pax, before his entire assembled kingdom, knelt. "They told me my wolf was dead," he said, and his voice broke on it, and he let it break. In front of everyone. "It was not dead. It was waiting for you. I claim nothing tonight, Grace Holloway of Ashmore. I only ask, will you have me?" The field held its breath. Grace looked down at the kneeling king, and behind him at the dawn coming up over the wreck of every trap ever laid for her, and she reached down and drew him up to his feet, because she had had a lifetime's fill of anyone kneeling to anyone. "Ask me properly," she said, through tears, laughing, "when we have both washed off the blood." And the king of the United Pax threw back his head and laughed, really laughed, the ambushed laugh she had only ever heard once through a doorway, and 50,000 people watched their winter king come back to life on a battlefield at dawn, and no one who stood on the sacred field that morning ever forgot it. The trial of Edmund Crane lasted 11 days, and the kingdom stopped to listen to every one of them. He was tried in the same council chamber, where an assassin's blade had once opened everything, before the full assembly of the Pax, and the crown's case was read aloud, exactly as Grace had promised him on the stone. Every page, every name, the predated surveys, the falling strokes, the Southern purse, and the Northern voice. Peter Finch, the small gray clerk, testified for 2 full days, in a voice that grew steadier with every hour, and by the end of it, he stood straight, for perhaps the first time in his life. 3 other conspirators, lords who had grown fat on carved Ashmore land, broke and confessed, before the evidence even reached them, racing each other for mercy. Crane himself confessed nothing, explained nothing, and performed nothing, sitting silver and still through all 11 days. And somehow that silence told the Pax more about what he had always truly been than any confession could have. On the 12th day, the assembly delivered its verdict without one dissenting voice, and the judgment of 6 years earlier was formally struck from the record of the realm. The name Holloway was declared clean. The name Ashmore was declared honored, and the crier read a final line into the ringing silence of the chamber, a line the king had written into the judgment in his own hand. "Let it be recorded that Richard Holloway of Ashmore died not a traitor to the crown, but its most faithful servant, and let his name be spoken accordingly, forever." Grace sat through that last line with her spine straight and her hands folded in front of the entire assembly, and she did not weep because she had promised herself she would not. She wept afterward, in a quiet corridor, into the shoulder of a king, for a long time, and he held her and said nothing, because he had learned by then exactly when she needed words and when she needed walls, and he was proud, he told her much later, to be either. The restoration of Ashmore began before the snow had fully gone. The stolen lands came back to the crown by forfeit and were returned whole, and word went out along every road of the United Pax to any survivor of the old northern fire, "Come home." Grace rode north with the first wagons, and stood in the ruins where her family's house had been, in spring mud and birdsong, and found that the ground held no ghosts anymore, only earth, waiting. They came in slowly through the spring and summer, the scattered ones, in ones and threes and families, faces she half remembered grown older, children born in exile who had never seen the valley they were named for, and every single one of them stopped in the road the first time they saw who was overseeing the raising of the new great hall, the scarred woman on the timber stacks, with her sleeves rolled and her face bare to the sun, and every one of them was told the same thing before they could bow. "We do not kneel here. Pick up a hammer." The wedding, when it came, was nothing the noble houses expected and everything the kingdom needed. Grace refused the capital's cathedral, and married Ethan Cole in the open air, on the sacred field, on the white path where she had carried the basin, with the packs gathered on the same slopes, this time in sunlight. Molly stood beside her, weeping so loudly through the vows that the crowd began to laugh, and Grace laughed too, in her wedding crown, in front of everyone, and did not care at all. Daniel Hart stood beside the king, and was heard to remark that of the two great gambles His Majesty had made in his life, reopening a closed judgment and marrying the woman who came with it, he had somehow lost neither, and that this was statistically outrageous. She was crowned Luna Queen at midsummer, in the old way, under the open sky. She wore no veil. She had burned every veil she owned, actually, and deliberately, in the fireplace of the north wing, on the night of the verdict, and Ethan had stood beside her, and watched the gray cloth curl into flame, and neither of them had said a word, because some ceremonies need no witnesses, and no words. At the crowning, when the temple keeper hesitated over the ancient formula, which asked the moon to overlook the flaws of the candidate, the new senior elder, a sharp and honest woman of the Eastern Pax, set down the book and improvised, and her words became the words every crowning used thereafter. We ask the moon to overlook nothing. She has seen this woman entirely, and answered. The scars stayed, of course. Magic light and true love do not erase skin, whatever the fireside stories claim, and Grace would not have wished them gone. She noticed, in her first year as queen, how the burned and the marked and the hidden of the kingdom had begun to come to the open audiences, people who had spent their lives in shadows and scarves, coming simply to stand in the same room as a queen whose face was a map of survival, worn without apology, and she understood that this, as much as any law she would ever seal, was the work. On the first night of autumn, a year and some days after a cold wind had turned in a laundry yard, Grace stood on the balcony of the north wing and looked down at that yard, small and ordinary in the dusk, white sheets on the lines moving softly. Ethan came out and stood behind her, his arms folding around her, his chin on her hair, and for a while they watched the palace lamps come on one by one below. I used to stand at this window, he said at last, for 5 years, and feel nothing at all. I thought that was strength. I used to stand down there, she said, and plan how to disappear. I thought that was survival. She turned in his arms, and looked up at him, at the Winter King, the whole world had once called stone, whose face now did the quiet, undefended thing it did only for her. We were both wrong, you know. Hiding is not survival, and feeling nothing is not strength. No, he agreed. As it turns out, strength is a laundry girl, with a basin. She laughed, and the sound carried down into the yard, where a young maid, hanging the last of the sheets, looked up, startled, at the sound of a queen laughing in the dark, and smiled to herself, and went back to her work. Far below, the wind moved through the drying lines, lifted the white sheets like wings, turned, and carried the scent of rain and jasmine out over the palace walls, over the city, over the wide, quiet, mended kingdom, and there was no one left in all of it that she needed to hide from, ever again. She had come to the palace of her enemy, to disappear. Instead, for the first time in her life, she was entirely, joyfully, permanently seen. And the moon, the old keepers liked to say afterward, whenever they told the story on winter nights, had known it all along, from the very first turning of the wind. The moon had simply been waiting, as mothers do, for her daughter to stop running and look up.